Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dave, for introducing me, and Terry and FRI for organizing these lovely webinars. Today, I'm going to, as Dave told you before, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've been doing in the last couple of years for the Landscapes in Motion project. And so today, it'll be on why and how we incorporate partial stand mortality in landscape dynamic models of mixed severity fire regimes. And of course, this is collaborative work with several people. So without further ado, I'd like to today give you a little bit of an introduction of what is fire severity or mixed fire severity, why we should study it and how we can do that, and brush over how we are developing models of mixed severity fire regimes, what are some of the essential components of these models, and how we can use data to fill the knowledge gaps we have. And then I'm going to show you some of the results we've had so far. And so I'm sure you all know that fires are extremely common across Canada, especially if we look at montane forests. So here we have the purple and dark green montane forests, and then the boreal forests as well are very commonly disturbed by fire. So these are the other greens here, and the taiga forests on the top, yellow and orange. So it is a very common disturbance in Canada, as you can see from the burned area map on the left. These fires in Canada can reach gigantic sizes, as you know, and of course they have very strong consequences for both fauna and flora and even for human populations. And one of the most striking consequence of fires is, of course, vegetation and forest mortality. And that's why usually when we talk about fire severity, we use the post-fire vegetation mortality as a proxy for the level of fire severity. And so fire severity is affected by multiple factors. One of them is topography. We usually have fires that spread upwards in the slope, and they become more intense and, of course, more severe as they move up due to, just heat convection. They're also affected by climate and weather conditions. So here in this graph, we have a sort of climatic map of temperature on the x-axis and precipitation on the y. And what they've done is they mapped the fires on this climate map from the late 1800s in California to present. And you can see that the worst, more severe and larger fires that are circled in the squares and diamonds are all on the on the side of hot and dry weather. So clearly weather affects the fire severity and fire sizes. And here we also see, of course, an effect of climate change, because the points in terms of temperature and time are sort of moving to the lower right corner. And finally, vegetation is a strong determinant as well of fire severity. This is a very interesting picture of a fire that happened in BC. We have, again, a very large fire that burnt a lot of this forest, but it didn't burn the recently planted trees. So they are younger, probably moisture. And it's interesting how the fire completely surrounded this new planted forest plot. So clearly the vegetation is having a role here. And so, of course, we can then classify severity in different levels according to these conditions and their spatial and temporal arrangement. And so we have fires that can have very low severity, as we saw in the picture before. So here we see that the fire sort of burned the base of these trees. It burnt the understory vegetation, but most of the stand is alive and well. We have moderate severity fires where we have a partial mortality of the stand. And so depending on where we sort of cut the picture, if we look at the picture as it is now, we have, clearly part of the stand wasn't burnt. There's a clear barrier here or something that happened and the fire didn't propagate. But even on the left side of the stand, we still see some green trees, and it seems like part of that that cover did not burn completely or didn't die. And then we have, of course, in certain conditions of weather, climate, topography, and vegetation, we have fires that become extremely severe and have basically kill most of or the totality of the vegetation of the forest. So depending on the arrangement in time and space and how we look at fires, so are we looking at a stand, are we looking at a landscape, are we looking at records in time, we can then classify a fire or stand as having a combination of low, moderate, and high severity fires, and that's what classifies the regime as the mixed severity fire regime. And so here, for example, we see that this fire, so this particular fire event, is a mixed severity fire event because we have patches that didn't burn, patches that burnt a little bit, so moderate severity, and then patches that burned very much at high severity. And then we can also look at a time scale, as I said, and look at a mixed severity regime. And this is a result from work that Cameron Nafasi in the Landscapes in Motion project did as well in the past. And so he used samples of tree cores and fire stars to actually reconstruct the fire history of a particular stand, a particular location. And what we see here is that we see these red lines, they are fire events, and the bars are the number of trees. In this case, I think there are different species according to the colors. And what we see is some fires we don't see any surviving trees from before the fire. So it means, well, either all of them died for other reasons or that fire killed all of that vegetation. So it is possible that the fire in the mid-1700s and the early 1800s is a high severity fire because we don't see any surviving trees from before. On the other hand, the next two fires did not burn these trees that are from this age and have survived. So they are either more moderate severity fires or lower severity fires. So this stand, again, has seen a mixed severity fire regime. So it's important to just remember that when we look at mixed severity, we can think about a spatial pattern or a temporal pattern. And so it's extremely important that we understand these regimes. And one of the reasons why it's important is because it has, implications for forest management, because management companies try to emulate natural ranges of variation of the ecosystem, so try to emulate the disturbances that those ecosystems suffer. And so if we know that a certain ecosystem only suffers high severity fires, the cutting, for example, of that stand will try to emulate that. So it'll cut it completely. It'll be a clear cut and it will try to follow the temporal frequency of those, let's say high severity fires, but through cuts. If, on the other hand, we know that a particular forest ecosystem is more likely to suffer mixed severity fires, then of course the cutting, the management of the forest has to emulate that. So either they will do cuts that allow, depending on the frequency, to some partial surviving of the stand, or they will have to emulate some spatial heterogeneity. So this will have very important consequences for management. There are also consequences for biodiversity and wildlife. It is known that certain species like morels thrive after fire in some locations, but it depends on the severity of these fires. So moderate to severely burned sites seem to be good for these morels, and they are important for human populations, but also to fix certain nutrients for the next, species, the other types of vegetation that rely on these associations with fungi. And then finally, there's consequences for fauna as well. Lynx has been shown to use partially burned forests and fire islands very fast after a fire. So it's so a mixed severity fire will offer more habitat to the lynx than a very high severity fire that burns everything within its perimeter. And this is true as well for caribou. So if we have unburnt patches, they will probably sustain, older trees that maybe have more lichen. There will be some clearing of the forest in terms of light that might facilitate the regeneration of lichen cover. So all of these dynamics are extremely important for these and other species as well. And then finally, the more we understand about fire regimes, the more we can predict what is going to happen from location A to location B. So if the composition of location A and B in terms of vegetation, let's say, and climate and topography is similar, maybe we can expect a similar fire regime, or the inverse. If it's very dissimilar, then we shouldn't expect the same fire regime. At the same time, we can predict how these regimes will change if environmental conditions change as well, like temperature. And so, of course, again, this will have implications for management of wildlife, of forests, etc. And so how do we study mixed severity fire regimes? There's different techniques we can use, and I'm sure I'm not going to exhaust all of them, but common ones are using aerial photography to delimit the perimeters of fires and then delimit the different patches of severity that we see within a fire. There are dendroecological analyses, as I mentioned before, that look at fire scars and dating tree age to reconstruct fire history and fire severity. And then we can go even further back in time and use paleoecological analysis and analysis of sediments to reconstruct really far back fire history in the system. And then we can use models, as I do, to try to simulate what we know about this system. And of course, these models will draw information from other sources like photography, dendroecology, and even paleoecological analysis. But the important thing is that without models, we can't easily predict what's going to happen if we change the conditions. And this is what I'm going to talk about today mostly, is how we use these models and how we make them. That said, it's not so easy to model severity, mostly because we have a lot of data gaps. So the pre-industrial period records on severity are relatively scarce. They rely mostly on chronological samples. And at the same time, if we look at drivers of severity, so what causes severity to be higher or lower, the further we are from today, so in the pre-industrial period, the coarser the information we can get. So it becomes harder to understand the relationships and cause and consequence. And for the post-industrial period, there is information, but it's not super well spread, and it's not a lot. So again, gaps on both the severity side and also on the drivers of that severity. But we do have approaches that try to calculate this in terms of modeling. We have fire behavior models that are extremely detailed on trying to understand what happens as fire spreads, what is the behavior of fire. They are often based on a few burning experiments on not a lot of different forest systems, so they rely a lot on extrapolation and expert knowledge. They're also based on combustion physics a lot, and so they're mostly focused on fire risk rather than what happens after a fire and how that affects the next fire. On the other hand, we have forest landscape models like Landis and other models that can be simpler and more complex. But again, because of the data gaps, they're mostly based on expert knowledge. Some are extremely simple and ignore a lot of the interactions, and others that don't ignore a lot of the interactions require really heavy parameterization, and again, a lot of it drawn from expert knowledge. And many of these models do assume stand replacing fire, so very high severity, 100% mortality. So truly what we're lacking is an integration of the data that we have and the simulation models that we can get. And if we do that data integration, what we gain is that severity becomes more flexible and more respondent to changes in environmental context, and we rely less on expert opinion, which we will always need to a certain degree, but the more we can use data, the better. And so that's what the Landscapes in Motion project is all about. It's trying to marry 3 sources of information to understand mixed severity fire regimes in the southwestern Alberta foothills. So we try to look at, there's a team, the Mountain Legacy Project team, that looks at pairs of oblique photographs to understand changes in the landscape. There is the team of the Tree Lab that uses dendroecological analysis to reconstruct fire history and severity. And then there's the team that I'm myself part of, and we try to use as much information from the other teams as possible to develop models. And so again, just going very briefly, a study area, it is located in the southwestern Alberta foothills. Right here, it's pretty diverse with a lot of different ecosystems. It has a fairly large elevation gradient, and there has been a strong suspicion of mixed severity fire regimes. So it is important that we try to understand and model partial stand mortality in this landscape. Sorry, I should have skipped that slide before. So these are just examples of different types of ecosystems you can see in the field. And the 2 bigger questions that I'm talking about today is, what is the influence of simulating stand replacing versus partial mortality fires for, post-fire vegetation recovery? Does it make a difference? And how do we simulate or parameterize how much we kill when we have a fire spreading in a bottle from data? And so the essential components of this model, and again, this is really brushing over the complexity of it, is that we need a module that simulates a vegetation dynamics, so what happens to the trees. And of course, this model relies on some data to put the trees in the places where they should be and have them behave in the way that we expect them to behave in terms of reproduction and mortality and so on. And then, of course, we need a module that spreads fire through the landscape, but it needs to know what is there to burn. So there's a module called biomass fuels that basically connects the vegetation to the fire spread model by calculating the type of fuel available. And then, of course, the fire spread module feeds back into the vegetation one, because the vegetation one needs to know, okay, well, I had a fire in this particular location, what happened? So there's a module that basically calculates how much of the vegetation will burn or die, and then what is able to recover after the fire. And then we, of course, want these modules to respond to topographic and climate or weather conditions. And so we have another piece that basically integrates this information and affects both the calculation of the fuels and the fire properties that influence spread through the landscape. And all of these modules are acting and repeating their tasks in both basically in a spatial explicit manner, but also temporally, so they keep running over time. And so today I'm just going to talk hopefully not too long about a simulation experiment where I changed the regeneration piece. And so in one scenario, I said, okay, if a fire burns through this particular location, it'll kill everything. So there's no partial mortality, a total stand replacing fire. And the other option, the other scenario, is that the fire kills only part of the vegetation. And then to simplify things, it's only one fire, very big fire, a fake map. It happens once in the beginning of the simulation that is done. And so the results are that, so on the left side, we have no partial mortality, and on the right side, we have partial mortality. And what we see is the fire burned this lower part of the landscape here. And we see that if we have a stand replacing fire, the lodgepole pine is able to recover very fast. So the fire happened at year 5, and because this species is serotinous, If it was there before, it'll have a high probability of just recovering after fire. If we have partial mortality, that means that some part of the stand survives, and that has some shade on the seeds of lodgepole pine. So it's not really so facilitated to to do serotiny and germinate after fire. On the other hand, aspen seems to benefit quite a bit from the fact that there is a surviving stand because it disperses much further than the other species that are conifers. It grows faster than the other species, and it's also sexually mature sooner. So even though it doesn't like shade so much, and there's some shade after the partial mortality, the fact that it's still there and part of it may have survived the fire, it just facilitates its spread after the fire happens. And so we see the same dynamics, the same tendency on this graph, where we see the changes in the log of the biomass over time. And again, the fire happens at year 5 in this dashed line, and we see how lodgepole pine is able to recover very fast if we have a stand replacing fire on the left. But if we have a partial survival, it's not as happy with the shade, and the aspen really takes over really, really fast. It's interesting to see how the other species, in this case, Douglas fir, white spruce, and Engelmann spruce, which were the species present in the fire location, don't seem to be so much affected in terms of biomass, at least, by these different dynamics. On this next graph, what we see different is what is able to be maintained in the landscape in terms of dominant vegetation. So basically, we see the number of pixels, and I'm sorry, I think the y-axis label is not correct. It's the proportion of pixels that have a certain species as the dominant species. And then, so we see with no partial mortality, so with stand replacing fire, lodgepole pine becomes very dominant at the beginning, then aspen starts to take over. But if we have some partial survival, it's interesting to see how white spruce, the yellow one, and Douglas fir are able to maintain more of their dominance in certain pixels than they would if it was a stand replacing fire. So it's important to see how these dynamics change in the scenarios. And of course, this will have repercussions if we think about wildlife and biodiversity. If we maintain older cohorts for longer, maybe this will support more lichen, and that will support more caribou populations. Again, if we open the canopy a little bit, but we don't kill everything, again, that might support the recovery of the lichen biomass and offer more habitat and forage for caribou. And in general, if we have partially surviving stands, there's generally a quicker wildlife recovery in the fire perimeter. But we can improve this, of course. We have a very expert-based parametrization of vegetation killed that comes from Landis 2 in this case. And this determines that only older cohorts will survive, regardless of the species. So it would be nice to have something that is a little bit more flexible and a little bit more dependent on the conditions of topography, vegetation, and climate. And so that's why I'm trying to parametrize the amount of stand mortality from the data that we have. And so this data is photo-derived from a lot of fires, past fires that happened in northern parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Unfortunately, we don't have data or so much data for the area, our city area. We have it associated with pre-fire vegetation conditions, fire weather, and topography. And when all of this is combined, we are left with 36 fires that are analyzable. I gridded all of this information, and I tried to analyze this as a model that searches the relationships between severity, vegetation, climate, and topography. And the important thing about these models is that they're not our conventional models. Basically, I am allowing different components of severity to respond to different covariates. So, for example, the probability of having zero severity and the probability of having maximum severity are driven by different aspects. At the same time, the average level of severity is also driven by different combinations of covariates. And so I don't want to go more into detail, but this is extremely important when we're modeling severity properties. The results I'm going to show are only showing a quarter of the data because these models take a long time to run. And I added random effects for all of these components, just so that you know. And briefly, the results are interesting. So it shows that when we look at the average severity, so I'm really just looking at the average level of severity, the wetness index is a very important factor in affecting how much severity we get. So the wetter it is, it's just a very weird relationship where we get a lot of variance. We're in very wet sites where we have higher severity, but also very low. So it might be that in these sites, it's either the vegetation is playing a role or it's just very heterogeneous. So it can go both ways. And then we have a peak of severity at intermediately low values of wetness. So I think I should look at these models again because this is a sort of strange relationship, but it's interesting to see it. So we have to go further here. Clearly, having a forested cover versus a non-forested cover increases severity. So this is a very clear relationship. And then when we look at, for example, the cover of larch, we see that its role on severity levels changes depending on the stand age. So not the age of the larch, but the overall stand age. So if we have a very old stand or an older stand, but a lot of larch, it seems like the severity can be lower. So we associate this because larch is not super flammable when compared to other conifers. On the other hand, if the stand is fairly young, even if the larch cover is high, it burns more easily. On the other hand, the percentage of flammable conifers, more flammable conifers like lodgepole pine, has the effective age is less important. So if it is an old stand, it'll always have a fairly high level of severity. Younger stands will have lower values, but they're still higher than what we see for larch. Notice how the y-axis changes. So to wrap up, and I'm sorry that this was a little bit longer than it should have been, what is important is that we integrate this sort of information that we get from statistical models that are trying to explain what affects severity the most, integrate that information with our simulation model so that we can have the simulation model estimating post-fire mortality on the fly in response to these factors like vegetation and weather and so on. And so basically what we'll have is, as I said, this stand mortality depending on these, and then the model can change these as time moves. And then the severity will vary that. So we can play around with these and try to develop predictive scenarios of, for example, what would happen under climate change. This provides more flexibility, more sensitivity to changing conditions, and a more scalable and transferable model, because then we can move it to other parts of Canada or even the world if some of the properties are common. So really important for prediction here. And if you don't remember anything about my presentation tomorrow, this is what I would like you to remember. So it's important to account for partial stand mortality and how it changes the expected post-fire dynamics. This is important for, both in a simulation context for mixed severity fire modeling, but also if we think about consequences for how we predict biodiversity changes. And then the next message is it'll be fundamental to integrate data and simulation so that we can directly model how severity responds to environmental conditions, both in time and space. And again, this will be not only important in simulation context, but how we predict changes in biodiversity. And I put a little arrow here, it's like, well, maybe we could even connect this to, say, a caribou model that will respond to these components. So again, I'm sorry for taking a little bit longer than I should have. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks so much for listening, and thanks to my co-authors, people that helped me throughout this work, Terry and Dave and Webinar Wednesdays listeners, and also all of the associations that have helped me monetarily to do this work. Thank you so much.